Hello, this is Jeremiah Gibson. I'm the Executive Director of the New England Association for Family and Systemic Therapy. I'm so happy to be joined this afternoon by Scott Cohen. Scott is a former president of the Massachusetts Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Scott served for 15 years on the Allied Board of Mental Health as a representative for MFTs. And he's currently the treasurer of the Association for Marriage and Family Therapy Regulatory Boards. Scott, did I get all that right?
That sounds good to me, Jeremiah.
Great. So Scott and I are talking today about an online continuing education option called the Tales from the Licensing Board, the ethical issues facing couple and family therapists. And this is a home study that's being done in conjunction with the Couple and Family Institute of New England. For more information, you can get on their website, coupleandfamilyinstitute.com. So Scott, one of the things that I'm curious about is, before we talk about the program, is how did you become interested in studying the ethical processes of marriage and family therapy?
Well, Jeremiah, I've been a longtime marriage and family therapist for the last 40 or so years. And I was president, as you said, of the Mass Association. I got involved in lots of different things with AAMFT and the Mass Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. And after my term as president and then past president, there was an opening on the Allied Board of Mental Health Division of Registration, Allied Board of Mental Health. So it's something that I kind of gravitated towards, and I became a board member. And that was back in probably 1990 or thereabouts. And I served there, my first term there, for about 8 years. And I was sort of the second generation of Board of Registration board members. The first generation were those folks who actually put together and implemented the law licensing marriage and family therapists, as well as mental health counselors and the other professions on the board. And so I served, as I said, for about 7 or 8 years there. And then I left the Board of Registration, only to find myself coming back on the Board of Registration another 8 years later and served another 7 years, and actually just left the board within the last couple of months. So the Board of Registration's tasks, really, it is a, first of all, as a gubernatorial appointee twice, and the task, the legislative task, is really for consumer protection. It is a board that issues licenses to marriage and family therapists, as well as mental health counselors, educational psychologists, behavior analysts, and rehab counselors. It propagates the requirements for licensure, and it hears ethical cases when people run afoul of some of the ethics of our profession. So it's something that I sort of drifted over to after my time at MMFT. And as I said, I've been on the board for about 15 years, and hopefully I've learned an awful lot about ethics myself in that process.
Yeah, I can imagine that reading through some of the ethics complaints, reading through some of the paperwork, that you've learned a lot about what not to do, as well as how to ethically and effectively practice couple and family therapy. I'm curious, Scott, in the video, in the presentation, what are some of the ethical issues that you talk about?
So the presentation is actually 5.5 hours of CE, I've been told. And we talk about informed consent. We talk about the responsibility when treating minors in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We go over the actual AMFT Code of Ethics to talk about that. We talk about how to make a professional will, which I don't think many of us have at all. One of the interesting things, as you said, I've learned a lot about what not to do. I always thought of myself as a pretty ethical person, but I was really struck often by some of the cases we heard and some of the things that I thought to myself, oh boy, I have to really be careful for me, because even though I thought I knew a bunch of stuff, it has been an incredible learning experience for me to go through this. And then at the end of the presentation, after going through a bunch of the ethical stuff as we talked about, we spend the last hour and a quarter or so talking about cases. Now, these are not verbatim cases. Obviously, due to confidentiality issues, I could not do that. But they are a compilation of interesting case material that has come up that I put together. And my presentation was, you be the board of registration, you be a ruler on here, you be and hear the cases, and you tell me if you think there are ethical violations here, and if so, what would you do? So the last hour and a half actually was kind of fun because we got to go over some cases.
Yeah. Scott, my understanding is that MFTs in Massachusetts aren't required to do a CE set in ethics like other licenses are, or like other MFTs in other states are. So I'm curious what makes it really important, specifically for marriage and family therapists, but really for anyone who practices couple and family therapy, to do the workshop like this in the ethics of couples and family therapy.
So first of all, I think it's ethically required individually of each individual to pay attention to ethics. Right. Ethics can be kind of a dry topic, but I do think that we need to look at our own ethics. It's interesting you mentioned that it's not required in the statute at this point in the regulation. One of the things that I did before I left the board, in concert with the current board member, Jackie Gagliardi, we actually have in the process of rewriting the regulations, and we're actually have already presented them to the board. They have to go through public hearing, and one of the requirements in the new requirements is in fact to have 3 CEs every licensing cycle in ethics. As you said, many other states have it. As I sit on the Association of Marriage and Family Therapy Regulatory Board, and I go to the annual conference in which generally probably 30 other states are represented at any one given time, I hear what all of the other states are doing, and a lot of them have requirement in ethics. This last licensing cycle, as people know, there was a requirement to have 2 CEs in domestic violence. Right. In addition, some states require CEs in teletherapy, and we'll talk a little bit about that because that's one of the other issues, and especially now with COVID. Yep. And some other states have other requirements in not just ethics, but knowing their state's laws and regulations, which we do not have either.
You mentioned a bit ago COVID-19, and I'm really curious what ethical considerations you're seeing come up with COVID-19, and particularly as more therapists are moving into teletherapy.
So it's really very interesting, the whole concept of what's going on with COVID-19, because at this point, very few clients are being seen face-to-face. They're all with telehealth. And telehealth is the big new wave. And we have sort of let the genie out of the bottle, that telehealth is now going to be here to stay. Right. However, the difficulty is in this day and age of COVID, the insurance companies and even the licensing boards across the nation have basically waived HIPAA requirement and for any issues about doing telehealth, teletherapy. So in teletherapy now, we can use any platform, whether it be HIPAA compliant or not. And the rules and regulations are thrown out the window. And there's no requirement for any level of training in teletherapy. So I think that since we as a profession and the world has experienced teletherapy, as I said, the genie's out of the bottle. Teletherapy is here to stay. We will be doing a lot more work in telehealth and teletherapy. However, one of the things that I know I'm pushing for, and I have made a proposal to the Board of Registration in Allied Mental Health in Massachusetts, is that they do institute some level of teletherapy guidelines. So there is a document that is in the bibliography that is a document called the Association of Marriage and Family Therapy Regulatory Board's Teletherapy Guidelines. One of the parts of this training does include this AMFTRB. 2 years ago when we did the training, I included it about some of the difficulties of teletherapy. So, right off the get-go, teletherapy, how do you get informed consent when you're doing teletherapy? And it's verbal. And then there's the question about whether therapy is synchronous or asynchronous. Well, synchronous means that it's like what we're doing right now, having an interaction. It's in real time. So whether that be in a video, whether it be in the telephone, it's real time. Other therapies do through email. So email is asynchronous. So you get an email and then some time expires in between and you respond to someone. Text can be synchronous or asynchronous, but there are the issues of how are you conducting your therapy. In Massachusetts, one of the issues as well is where the therapist is. So, for instance, in Massachusetts, the regulations clearly state that therapy takes place where the client is. The therapist can be anywhere. The client is in Massachusetts. So as a teletherapist, if I want to see someone, even a college student, for instance, up in New Hampshire or in Colorado, I would have to be licensed in that state.
Even if that person has a residential address in Massachusetts.
That's correct, because in theory, the therapy takes place where the client is. So one of the things we've talked a lot about in AMFTRB is how wonderful it would be to have a national certification that was accepted by every state to do teletherapy. Failing that, another avenue for that is a compact, interstate compact. And the most well-known type of interstate compact is driver's licenses. So you might have a driver's license in Massachusetts, but you can drive anywhere else in the country and they honor the Massachusetts driver's license. So if and that's a legislative issue. So if the legislature were to agree to a national compact, and I know the nurses have probably about half the states have belong to a nursing compact. So there are a lot of issues in teletherapy. That legal part, liability is an issue. The whole issue of if you're not doing face-to-face, even telephone, are you seeing the person you think you're seeing? We've heard about all these scams about online stuff that people posing as other people, mostly for devious methods, for devious means. But, are you really doing that? And then the issue of diagnosis. Well, if you're not seeing a person face-to-face and only telephone, or even if you do face-to-face, there's a really severe limit to what you can see and how you can do it. Text-based therapy has its severe limitations, and even face-to-face like this, I can only see your face, Jeremiah. I can't see the rest of your body language. So you might be making all sorts of obscene gestures at me, and I can't even see it. So these are some of the issues that we talk about in teletherapy and the limitations of it, as well as how it's regulated, how secure, how encrypted a server might be, how secure it is. I mean, we're doing a Zoom right now, Jeremiah, but I'm sure you've heard the stories of how people have been
Zoom bombed
into Zoom and doing all sorts of things. So right now in our world, we're allowing a lot because of COVID. But I think that in the future, we're going to be pulling back. And I know that most states who are talking about it are talking about teletherapy guidelines that have to be HIPAA compliant.
I'm curious, when you think about teletherapy, what are other ethical considerations to consider in teletherapy that you don't have to consider as much in face-to-face therapy?
So again, is your server encrypted? Is it secure? Are you protecting the confidentiality of your client? And depending upon how it is, does someone else have access to their email? All of that stuff is really important. It takes a skill set to conduct teletherapy. Not everyone has the skill set. Certainly not many people have training. In Massachusetts, we don't have teletherapy regulations right now. Some states do, most states do not. It is something that will be coming up, I think, for most every state. Everyone's been thrown into it. People are learning how to do it, but I think there are certain skill sets that and training that we should have.
What are other important ethical gaps that people miss that you talk about in the Tales from the Licensing Board presentation?
So again, we go over the AAMFT Code of Ethics, which is the code of ethics licensed marriage and family therapists have to adhere to. That's actually one of the answers of the CE questions. So I'm giving it right now to you. And we talk about working with minors. Working with minors especially is difficult because in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, best practices require you to have the consent, both parents, even though they might be divorced or separated.
Right.
Especially, I guess, if they're divorced or separated. And there are many, many, many cases that we hear about therapists getting complaints filed on them because one party says, I did not give you permission to treat my children. And my ex hired you, but I did not give permission. And I think you're badly influencing the kids against me because you're allied with my ex. So knowing custodial arrangements, certainly in divorce and separated issues, being able to review legal custody documents is an important element of it. And that's some of the stuff we talk about. Another thing we talk about is we talk about developing a professional will. That's really kind of interesting because it's nothing that I would have known about had I not served on the board and investigated some of this. So professional will really is what happens when you as a therapist retire or die suddenly. Who takes care of the records? Who do you transfer all of your professional information to? We've had certainly a number of cases where therapists have died suddenly and the client is left and not even knowing where to turn. So spelling out in advance, and that is part of informed consent. So we talk about informed consent and different informed consent forms and what it should include. And one of them is if you as a therapist die suddenly, what access do they have to their records or where would they go? So we talk a lot. So we moved on from wills to informed consent. What does a good intake sheet have? What is informed consent? And the degree to which the depth, I guess, maybe more than the degree, the depth to which what you have to look at in informed consent. In some way, it's actually really scary because very deep into it. I go deep into it in this presentation, and it's kind of scary. And I made the acknowledgement and admitted to the fact that my informed consent isn't as deep as I am talking about, but it is a really important issue about the concept of informed consent.
Right. Yeah, I'd be curious, those that are watching the video, how many folks have heard of professional wills? I, for one, have not. So thank you for sharing that and and so much other important, valuable information about how to do the work ethically and also inform our clients to the utmost extent.
And I'll tell you the last thing, Jeremiah, the presentation goes over is it does go over the Board of Registration. It goes over the makeup of the Board of Registration. And it also I talk a little bit about what happens when a case does get, when a complaint gets filed, and what is the process of when a complaint gets filed. And what the board then does and what the board's responsibility is to do, how it gets investigated. And then the very last piece, and I forget what I mentioned this yet or not, but the last piece is going over cases.
What are other ways that folks can stay engaged with best ethical practices?
So, ethics is generally thought of as a pretty dry topic. And I always, in my practice, was fearful of the dryness of ethics. But as I got into it and began to understand it more, to keep an eye on, things like confidentiality, we all know that stuff. First, do no harm. We know that. That's how we were trained. But just to be aware of the ethical considerations And I think the 3 CEs a year, every cycle, every 2 years of ethics is actually pretty important, because there are so many different elements of ethics. You know, use of self, that's ethics. How much you disclose, how much you not disclose. I don't talk about that in this training, but these are some of the other issues of ethics, and just kind of thinking about it in that regard.
Again, Tales from the Licensing Board, Ethical Issues Facing Couple and Family Therapists. You can find this online at coupleandfamilyinstitute.com. It's $85, $65 for folks who work in agencies. And this has been approved for LMFTs, social workers, mental health counselors, and licensed psychologists. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with me about a really, really important topic of ethics and best practice for doing couples and family therapy.
Well, thank you, Jeremiah. I appreciate the time spent with you and your insight and questions as well.
Thanks.